Wipe that confident look off your face, because your history teacher basically lied to you for 12 years straight, and I'm about to ruin your childhood with some premium historical nonsense. Like how the last guillotine execution in France happened the same year the first Star Wars movie hit theaters, meaning Darth Vader and Marie Antoinette's favorite execution toy fully coexisted. And I've got 111 brain-melting, that can't be real facts that are all 100% true, so if this video makes your brain short-circuit even once, hit like, subscribe, and use the YouTube hype button to push this video into the algorithm stratosphere, because hyping it literally helps this channel explode and unlock even crazier episodes, and if you don't, I will emotionally recover, but your third-grade crush might find out you still sleep with a nightlight. So let's get weird, hype the video, and expose history for the absolute dumpster fire it is. 1. The first electric printing telegraph, which was the great-grandfather of our modern fax machine, was patented way back in 1843, while the legendary samurai were still the high and mighty ruling class of Japan. Just imagine a fierce warrior in full traditional armor with a razor-sharp katana strapped to his side, walking into a dusty office to send a quick document to Abraham Lincoln, who was busy leading the United States during the Civil War. It sounds like a total glitch in the Matrix because we think these eras are centuries apart, but they actually overlapped in a way that makes history look absolutely ridiculous for us today. 2. While the ancient Egyptians were sweating under the desert sun to finish the Great Pyramid of Giza for their pharaohs, the last surviving woolly mammoths were actually still roaming around on a cold and lonely island in the Arctic. It feels like these massive furry beasts belonged to the prehistoric ice age of cavemen, but they were actually hanging out and eating grass while human civilization was building massive stone monuments that still stand today. This means a pharaoh could have theoretically sent an expedition to find a real-life mammoth if they had only known where to look, because history is much weirder than your textbooks ever told you. 3. Believe it or not, the Nintendo company was actually founded in the exact same year that London police were desperately hunting for the infamous serial killer Jack the Ripper. Back in 1889, a Japanese businessman was busy handcrafting playing cards in Kyoto, while halfway across the world people were terrified to walk the foggy streets of England because of a mysterious murderer. It is totally wild to think that Mario's distant ancestors were being born at the same time as the world's most famous criminal mystery, because our brains usually put video games and Victorian killers into completely different centuries of human existence, but they truly happened simultaneously. 4. Oxford University was already an established institution teaching students for over 200 years before the Aztec Empire was even founded in the middle of Mexico, while scholars in England were busy studying philosophy and Latin. In grand stone halls, the people who would eventually build the massive pyramids of Tenochtitlan had not even started their civilization yet. This means the legendary Aztecs are actually much younger than a rainy college in the United Kingdom, which feels completely wrong since we usually imagine the Aztecs as an ancient people from a lost world, while universities seem like a much more modern invention of our society. 5. When the first Star Wars movie was blowing people's minds in theaters in 1977, the government in France was still using the terrifying guillotine to perform their very last execution on a convicted criminal. It sounds like a total glitch in time because we think of lightsabers and space battles as the ultimate future, while public beheadings belong in a dusty museum from the French Revolution. This means you could have theoretically walked out of a cinema after watching Luke Skywalker and then hopped on a plane to Paris just to witness a medieval-style execution, which is absolutely ridiculous to imagine. 6. The legendary artist Pablo Picasso was still alive and probably complaining about the neighbors when Neil Armstrong took his giant leap for mankind on the moon in 1969. We usually place the creator of Cubism in a distant era of black and white photos, while the space race feels like the start of our modern high-tech world. The truth is that Picasso didn't actually pass away until 1973, which means he was sitting in his studio watching the moon, landing on a color television just like everyone else. It makes history feel like a weird fever dream when these two worlds collide so perfectly. 7. Harvard University was already a busy place where students were complaining about homework. In 1636, which was decades before Isaac Newton ever sat under a tree and invented calculus. This means that the very first graduates from the most famous college in America had absolutely no idea that complex math like derivatives even existed, because nobody had discovered them yet. It is hilarious to think about elite scholars being considered geniuses while having a math knowledge that was technically less advanced than a modern high school student. History proves that you can be the smartest guy in the room and still be totally clueless. 8. Both the brave young diarist Anne Frank and the legendary civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. were actually born in the exact same year of 1929. Our history books usually separate these two icons by decades because one story feels like a distant tragedy from World War II, while the other feels like a more recent struggle for American freedom. Realizing they were essentially the same age makes the timeline of human rights feel much closer and more connected than your teachers probably explained in class. It is a powerful reminder that history isn't just a list of dates, but a series of overlapping lives. 9. The refreshing taste of Coca-Cola was actually invented in 1886, which makes it a whole year older than the iconic Eiffel Tower in Paris. While the French were still arguing about whether that giant metal lattice was going to be an eyesore for their beautiful city, Americans were already getting hooked on the world's most famous soda. It is truly bizarre to imagine a world where people were drinking Coke while the most recognizable landmark on the planet didn't even exist yet. Sometimes our favorite snacks are more ancient than the massive stone and metal structures we consider to be timeless historical monuments. 10. The massive Great Wall of China was not actually finished until 1878, which means it was officially completed 2 years after the very first telephone call was made by Alexander Graham Bell. We usually think of this giant stone wall as something built by ancient emperors thousands of years ago, while the telephone feels like a modern invention that changed everything. The reality is that workers were still laying the final bricks on that ancient defense system while people in the United States were already chatting over wires. History loves to mess with your head by mixing up the ancient world with the modern tech era. 11. Cleopatra lived much closer to the invention of the iPhone than she did to the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza. We always group ancient Egypt into one big era, but it actually lasted so long that her time was more modern than ancient to her ancestors. Imagine the last pharaoh of Egypt walking around her palace and realizing that those massive stone tombs were already thousands of years old and shrouded in mystery. Even back then. It makes her feel less like a legendary goddess and more like a historical enthusiast living in a world that had already seen its greatest architectural achievements long before she was born. 12. In 1868, you could actually hop on the very modern London Underground train and ride it across the city specifically to go watch a public hanging. It is absolutely insane to realize that high-tech steam-powered transit existed at the exact same time as medieval-style public executions in the street. Imagine a group of people in fancy suits and top hats complaining about the train being late while they were on their way to see a criminal lose his life in front of a crowd. It makes the Victorian era look like a confusing mix of progressive engineering and incredibly brutal punishments that definitely belong in the past. 13. During a chaotic battle in World War II, a United States naval ship ran completely out of depth charges and decided to attack a Japanese submarine using nothing but potatoes. The American sailors started throwing the vegetables as hard as they could, and the enemy crew actually thought they were being hit with real hand grenades, so they spent precious time trying to throw them back into the ocean instead of fighting. It is probably the dumbest victory in military history because a high-tech underwater vessel was essentially defeated by a lunch side dish. This proves that you do not always need massive missiles when you have a crew. 14. George Washington once decided to spend his entire political campaign budget on booze, just to make sure he won the votes of the local people. Back in 1758, he bought nearly 160 gallons of rum and beer to pass out to everyone in town, because that was apparently the only way to get people interested in politics. It is hilarious to think that the father of our country essentially secured his early victory by hosting a massive open-bar party for everyone who lived in Virginia. This proves that American voters have basically been exactly the same for hundreds of years because everyone loves a free drink. 15. A clever con artist named Victor Lustig actually managed to sell the famous Eiffel Tower for scrap metal not just once but twice to different victims. He pretended to be a government official and convinced a group of businessmen that the tower was too expensive to maintain and needed to be torn down immediately. One poor guy was so desperate to make a deal that he even paid a massive bribe on top of the purchase price just to secure the medal. It is the most ridiculous scam in history, because people were so blinded by greed that they actually believed they could buy a world-famous national landmark forever. 16. The shortest war in human history happened between the British Empire and the island of Zanzibar, and it lasted for a grand total of 38 minutes. When the Sultan of Zanzibar refused to step down after an ultimatum, the British simply opened fire with their massive warships and destroyed the entire palace defenses in less time than a lunch break. The Sultan realized he had made a terrible mistake and fled the scene, while the British declared victory before their tea could even get cold. It is a hilariously lopsided conflict that proves you should never pick a fight with a superpower unless you have much more free time. 17. The longest war in human history lasted for over 335 years, but the most ridiculous part is that nobody was actually killed. This bizarre conflict started between the Netherlands and the tiny Isles of Scilly in 1651, and everyone simply forgot about it until a local historian realized the war was still officially active. When the two sides finally met to sign a peace treaty in 1986, they realized that generations of people had lived and died while technically being at war without ever firing a single shot. It is the ultimate example of a conflict that was perfectly harmless and also incredibly stupid and dumb. 18. A man named Thomas Crapper did not actually invent the flushing toilet, but he was so obsessed with selling plumbing supplies that his name became forever linked to going to the bathroom. He was a very successful businessman in London who branded all of his products with his own name, so people seeing the word on every toilet tank simply assumed he was the genius behind the invention. Even though several other people had created earlier versions of the device, Thomas Crapper was the one who made it popular and unintentionally gave us one of the most common slang words for human waste that we still use in our world. 19. The famous mathematician Pythagoras, who was a legend for his triangle theorem, actually had a terrifying and paralyzing phobia of beans that eventually led to his mysterious downfall. He believed that beans contained the souls of the dead, and he strictly forbade all of his followers from ever touching or eating them because he was convinced they were spiritually dangerous. According to legend, he was once being chased by enemies and stopped at the edge of a bean field, but he was so afraid of stepping on the plants that he refused to cross and was caught by his pursuers. It proves that even geniuses have incredibly dumb and weird. 20. In 1962, an absolutely bizarre laughter epidemic broke out in Tanzania that started with just a few schoolgirls and quickly spread to hundreds of people across several villages. This was not just a simple case of the giggles, because people were literally laughing and crying for weeks until they were physically exhausted and unable to function in their daily lives. The local schools had to be shut down because the situation was so out of control, and doctors were completely baffled by the weird psychological phenomenon that affected so many people. It remains one of the most ridiculous and strange medical mysteries that ever happened in our recorded human history. 21. In 1386, a pig in France was actually arrested and taken to court for the murder of a young child who was playing in the street. This sounds like a weird cartoon plot, but the villagers were dead serious about justice, and they even dressed the pig in human clothes, including a jacket and pants, before hanging it in the town square. This ridiculous event was perfectly legal, because animals were often put on trial during the Middle Ages to show that no one was above the law. It is the dumbest courtroom drama ever, because the defendant could only oink back at the judge. 22. Every single year in a tiny town in Ireland, people go out into the mountains to capture a wild goat, just so they can crown it as their king. This tradition, called the Puck Fair, has been going on for hundreds of years and involves putting the confused animal on a massive pedestal high above the crowd for 3 days of partying. While the goat is treated to plenty of food and water, it probably has no idea why thousands of humans are screaming and drinking beer in its honor below. It is a hilarious reminder that some ancient traditions are just plain weird and absolutely nonsensical. 23. In the 1700s, there was a secret society called the Order of the Pug, where members actually had to wear dog collars to get into meetings. To show their loyalty to the group, new recruits had to scratch at the door and bark like a dog until someone finally let them inside to join the party. It was a strange alternative for Catholics, who were banned from joining the Freemasons, so they decided that acting like puppies was the best way to keep their secrets safe from the public. This is definitely one of the dumbest ways to spend your Friday night with your friends. 24. King Henry VIII had one of the weirdest jobs in history called the Groom of the Stool, which basically meant being a royal bathroom assistant. These high-ranking men were responsible for monitoring the king's bowel movements and physically wiping him after he finished his business on the royal toilet. While this sounds like the grossest job ever, it was actually a highly coveted position because it gave these men constant private access to the king's ear for political gossip. Many of these bathroom attendants were eventually knighted for their dedicated service, which proves that literally any job can lead to a promotion. 25. Ancient Romans were so obsessed with having bright white teeth that they actually used imported Portuguese urine as a regular mouthwash. They believed that the ammonia in the liquid was the perfect chemical to scrub away stains and keep their smiles looking fresh for the local Senate meetings. This practice was so popular that the government even started taxing the trade of human waste because everyone wanted a piece of the action. It is absolutely disgusting to imagine starting your morning by gargling with someone else's bathroom break, but the Romans swore by it to keep their pearly whites shining bright. 26. Historical hair dyes were often made from the most disgusting ingredients you can imagine, including a massive amount of fresh pigeon poop. People in the past were willing to put almost anything on their heads if it meant they could achieve a vibrant and fashionable hair color for the royal ball. They would mix the bird droppings with other chemicals to create a paste that was supposed to lighten their hair or add a unique tint to their locks. It is a ridiculous and gross reality of ancient beauty standards that proves people have always been willing to do very stupid things just to look good for others. 27. Victorian women were so desperate to achieve a ghostly and pale complexion that they actually started eating arsenic-laced wafers as a beauty treatment. Even though they knew arsenic was a deadly poison, they believed that small doses would kill the red blood cells in their skin and give them that trendy, sickly look. This was basically like playing Russian roulette with your breakfast just to look like a fashionable vampire for your friends at the tea party. It is one of the most dangerous and dumbest beauty trends in history because looking good often meant dying a slow and very painful death. 28. In the Victorian era, men were so proud of their massive facial hair that they used special mustache teacups to protect their grooming. These cups had a tiny ceramic ledge inside that acted like a guard to keep their expensive mustache wax from melting into the hot tea while they took a sip. It is hilarious to imagine a group of fancy gentlemen sitting around in top hats worrying more about their facial hair falling apart than the actual conversation they were having. This proves that vanity has always been a major part of human history, even if it requires building ridiculous custom kitchenware. 29. For centuries, people were obsessed with wearing makeup that was heavily laced with lead just so they could achieve a perfectly white face. Even though the lead was literally rotting their skin and causing their hair to fall out, they kept applying more layers to cover up the damage. It was a vicious cycle of poisoning yourself for fashion that often led to madness or death because the beauty standards were so incredibly strict back then. This is a tragic and dumb example of how far people will go to follow a trend even if it means their own body is falling apart. 30. In the 1800s, people occasionally suffered from what were known as dental grenades, where their teeth would literally explode inside their mouths. This terrifying phenomenon happened because early dental fillings were made from a mix of different metals that could create a chemical reaction when they touched each other. If a person also had a pocket of gas trapped inside a decaying tooth, the pressure could build up until the whole thing popped like a firework in their jaw. It is a horrific and ridiculous medical nightmare that makes you feel very lucky to live in a world with modern dentistry. 31. During the Middle Ages and even up into the Renaissance, people in Europe were actually convinced that eating ground-up human remains was a miraculous cure for almost any illness. They would regularly consume powders made from ancient mummies stolen from Egyptian tombs because they believed the dead bodies contained a secret life force that could heal the living. It is absolutely horrifying to imagine a doctor prescribing a spoonful of crushed mummy to treat your headache, but this was a very common and respected medical practice back then. This proves that our ancestors were willing to be total cannibals if they thought it would help them. 32. For hundreds of years, Europeans were absolutely terrified of tomatoes because They were convinced the bright red fruits were actually deadly poison that would kill them instantly. The real problem was that wealthy people were eating their salads off of expensive pewter plates, which contained a high amount of lead that reacted with the tomato acid. When people got sick from the lead poisoning, they naturally blamed the innocent tomatoes instead of their fancy dinnerware and refused to eat them for centuries. It is a hilariously dumb misunderstanding that kept people away from pizza sauce and salsa for way longer than was necessary. 33. In Victorian England, there was a bizarre fashion trend called the Alexandra limp, where women would intentionally walk with a painful, uneven stride just to imitate a princess. After the Princess of Wales developed a slight limp from a bout of rheumatic fever, the public went wild and started wearing mismatched shoes to copy her style. Shopkeepers even started selling shoes with different-sized heels specifically to help healthy women struggle to walk properly in the streets. It is one of the most ridiculous examples of celebrity worship in history because people were literally paying money to pretend they were physically disabled for fashion. 34. Back in the 1830s, ketchup was not something you put on your fries, but was actually sold as a potent medicinal cure for things like indigestion and jaundice. A doctor named John Cook Bennett claimed that tomatoes were a miracle food, and he even turned the sauce into concentrated pills for people to take daily. This medical craze lasted for several years until people realized that eating red sauce was not actually curing their serious diseases, and the market eventually collapsed. It is funny to think that your favorite burger topping was once considered a serious pharmaceutical drug that you could buy at the local pharmacy. 35. During the 19th century, parents would regularly give their fussy children a product called Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, which was unfortunately heavily laced with a massive dose of morphine. While the syrup definitely succeeded in making the babies quiet, it was often because the children were falling into a dangerous and sometimes permanent sleep. It is a terrifying and dumb chapter of medical history because this deadly potion was sold legally over the counter as a safe remedy for teething babies. This proves that people in the past were surprisingly relaxed about giving their toddlers highly addictive and lethal drugs just for a little piece. 36. A park ranger named Roy Sullivan holds a world record that nobody would ever want because he was actually struck by lightning 7 different times and survived them all. This man was a literal human lightning rod who lost his eyebrows and had his hair set on fire multiple times while just trying to do his job in the woods. It is a ridiculous and nearly impossible run of bad luck that makes you wonder if the universe was personally out to get him. Despite the constant electrical shocks, he lived to be an old man, which proves that sometimes the luckiest people are also the most cursed. 37. An author named Morgan Robertson wrote a novel called The Wreck of the Titan, which featured a massive unsinkable ship hitting an iceberg in the North Atlantic. The truly creepy part is that this book was published 14 years before the real Titanic set sail, and it predicted almost every single detail including the ship's name. Both the fictional and real ships were around the same size, and they both lacked enough lifeboats for the thousands of passengers on board. It is a mind-blowing coincidence that sounds like a total lie, but it is a perfectly documented fact of literary and maritime history. 38. In 1838, Edgar Allan Poe wrote a story about 3 shipwrecked sailors who were forced to eat a cabin boy named Richard Parker to stay alive. Fast forward 46 years to a real-life shipwreck where 3 starving sailors actually decided to eat their cabin boy, whose name was also Richard Parker. It is one of the most haunting and bizarre coincidences ever recorded because the names and the grisly details match the fictional story perfectly. This is the kind of creepy historical fact that makes you question if writers are actually psychics who can see into a very dark and terrifying future world. 39. A man named Joseph Figlock was walking down a street in Detroit when a baby accidentally fell from a high window and landed directly in his arms. Exactly 1 year later, the very same man was walking down the exact same street when a completely different baby fell from another window, and he caught that one too. Both babies survived their falls without any injuries because Joseph happened to be in the right place at the right time twice in a row. It is a ridiculous and heartwarming coincidence that proves some people are just born to be heroes, even if they are just walking. 40. Months before the tragic assassination of Abraham Lincoln, his young son Robert was actually saved from a life-threatening train accident by a man named Edwin Booth. Edwin was a famous actor who grabbed Robert by the collar just as he was slipping off a platform and falling into the path of a moving train car. The absolute wildest part of this story is that Edwin Booth was the older brother of John Wilkes Booth, who would eventually kill Robert's father. It is a strange and twisted coincidence that the brother of a future murderer was responsible for saving the life of the president's own child. 41. Robert Todd Lincoln had the absolutely cursed luck of being present at or very near 3 out of the 4 major presidential assassinations in United States history. He was actually at his father's bedside when he died, and then he was standing right on the train platform when President James Garfield was shot by a madman. Years later, he was also attending a public event in Buffalo when President William McKinley was fatally wounded by an assassin just a few feet away from him. It is a terrifyingly dumb coincidence that made him decide to stop attending presidential events because he realized he was a literal bad luck charm. 42. Tsutomu Yamaguchi was a Japanese businessman who managed to survive the absolute unthinkable by being present for both atomic bomb blasts during the Second World War. He was in Hiroshima for a work trip when the first bomb dropped, and he survived with severe burns only to return to his hometown of Nagasaki just in time for the second massive explosion. He lived through both of the deadliest attacks in human history and somehow made it to the age of 93, which is a record of survival that sounds like a total Hollywood movie script. It is the ultimate example of being incredibly unlucky and miraculously lucky at exactly the same time. 43. There is a truly bizarre and slightly creepy pattern in American history where 3 of the first 5 presidents all happened to die on the 4th of July. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams both passed away on the exact same day in 1826, which was exactly 50 years after the Declaration of Independence was signed. Then James Monroe also died on the same patriotic holiday 5 years later, making people wonder if the Founding Fathers had some kind of secret pact with the universe. It is a ridiculous coincidence that makes the most important holiday in America feel like it has a very dark and mysterious side. 44. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson spent most of their lives as bitter political rivals who disagreed on almost everything about how to run the new United States. However, they eventually became friends in their old age through a series of long letters, and then they performed the ultimate finale by dying on the same day. As Adams lay on his deathbed, his very last words were that Jefferson still survived, but he had no idea that his friend had actually passed away just a few hours earlier. It is a hilariously dramatic end for 2 men who could never quite stay out of each other's business during their entire lives. 45. President Zachary Taylor holds the record for one of the most ridiculous and dumbest presidential deaths because he essentially killed himself by eating a snack. After attending a hot 4th of July celebration in 1850, he decided to cool down by consuming a massive bowl of fresh cherries and drinking a large amount of iced milk. The combination caused a severe case of stomach issues that eventually led to his death just a few days later while he was still in office. It is a tragic and strange reminder that even the most powerful man in America can be taken down by a simple summer treat eaten too quickly. 46. Alexander the Great was a legendary conqueror who may have suffered one of the most terrifying fates in history because he was likely paralyzed but still alive when he was buried. Modern scientists believe he suffered from a rare neurological disorder that made him look dead to his doctors while his brain was still fully functioning and aware. This means that as his soldiers were mourning their fallen leader and preparing his body for the tomb, he was probably lying there, unable to move or speak while watching his own funeral. It is a horrific and ridiculous medical mystery that makes his legendary life end in a nightmare. 47. Andrew Jackson was a notoriously tough president, but his pet parrot Pole was arguably even tougher, and definitely much ruder than his famous owner. The bird had spent so much time around the president that it learned how to swear like a sailor and would frequently unleash a stream of profanity at guests. The situation got so out of control during Jackson's funeral that the bird had to be physically removed from the room because it would not stop screaming colorful insults at the mourning crowd. It is a hilarious and dumb moment in history where a pet nearly ruined the dignity of a presidential memorial. 48. In 1912, a tailor named Franz Reichelt became convinced that he had invented a functional parachute suit that would allow pilots to safely jump from planes. To prove his invention worked, he decided to perform a public test by jumping off the first deck of the Eiffel Tower in front of a crowd of reporters. Instead of gliding gracefully to the ground, the suit completely failed to open, and he fell straight down to his death in a tragic and very public disaster. It is a ridiculous example of overconfidence where an inventor literally bet his life on a design that was fundamentally broken and dumb. 49. Long before the Wright brothers were born, an 11th century monk named Aylmer decided that he was going to be the first human to fly like a bird. He constructed a pair of large wooden wings and launched himself from the top of a tall abbey tower, hoping to catch the wind and soar over the village. He actually managed to glide for a short distance before crashing hard into the ground and breaking both of his legs, which left him with a permanent limp for the rest of his life. It is a bold and incredibly dumb attempt at early aviation that proves humans were always trying very hard to soar. 50. A man named Hans Steininger was famous in the 1500s for having a massive beard that reached all the way to his feet, but his prized facial hair eventually killed him. During a chaotic fire in his town, he was trying to run to safety, but he forgot to roll up his long beard and he accidentally stepped on it while rushing down a flight of stairs. He lost his balance and fell so hard that he broke his neck and died instantly on the spot because of his own grooming choices. It is the most ridiculous and dumbest death caused by vanity that has ever been recorded in history. 51. In 1963, the French space program decided to launch a stray tuxedo cat named Félicette into the great unknown instead of a monkey or a dog. This brave feline became the first cat in space and survived a high-altitude flight that sent her floating weightless for several minutes before her capsule safely parachuted back down to Earth. While the mission was a scientific success, it is absolutely hilarious and ridiculous to imagine a confused cat spinning around in zero gravity while scientists on the ground monitored her brainwaves. It is a weirdly adorable chapter in the space race that proves cats have been everywhere, including the stars. 52. Emperor Hirohito of Japan was a man of tradition, but he had a surprising and secret obsession with American pop culture that followed him even into the afterlife. When he passed away in 1989, he was buried in his formal imperial robes, but he was also wearing a classic Mickey Mouse watch on his wrist. He had received the watch as a gift during a visit to Disneyland in 1975, and he reportedly loved it so much that he wore it everywhere for the rest of his long life. It is a hilariously dumb and sweet detail that a powerful emperor was buried with a cartoon mouse. 53. You might think of it as a simple game for kids at summer camp, but tug-of-war was actually an official and highly competitive Olympic sport from 1900 until 1920. Massive teams of strong men would dig their heels into the dirt and pull with all their might to win a gold medal for their country while thousands of people cheered them on. It sounds like a ridiculous addition to the world's most prestigious athletic event, but the competition was intense and sometimes involved heated arguments over which boots were legal. It proves that the Olympics used to be a much weirder and more casual event for everyone. 54. The very first British officer to lose his life during the chaos of World War I was actually a man who was born in India. This is a bizarre and tragic fact that highlights how connected the world already was during that era of history, even before modern travel existed. We usually imagine the start of the Great War as a strictly European affair involving local soldiers, but this officer's story shows that the conflict was truly global from the very first day. It is a strange historical coincidence that serves as a reminder that the world is much smaller and more complicated than we usually think in school. 55. In the year 1913, there was a single city where four of the most influential and dangerous men in history were all living at the exact same time. Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, Leon Trotsky, and even the future dictator Josip Tito were all hanging out in the cafes of Vienna while essentially being neighbors. It is absolutely terrifying and ridiculous to imagine these future enemies walking past each other on the sidewalk or ordering coffee at the same shop without having any idea how they would eventually change the world. It proves that history is full of weird coincidences that feel like a bad movie plot. 56. The British military takes their tea time so seriously that every single tank they have produced since 1945 comes equipped with its own internal tea-making facilities. These high-tech armored vehicles include a special boiling vessel so that the crew can brew a fresh pot of tea without ever having to leave the safety of their tank during a battle. It is a hilariously stereotypical fact that sounds like a total joke, but the commanders realize that soldiers are much more effective when they are caffeinated and happy. This proves that even in the middle of a war, there is always time for a tea break. 57. In 1952, the world's most famous genius, Albert Einstein, was actually offered the position of being the second president of the newly formed country of Israel. Even though he was a deeply respected figure, he politely turned down the offer because he believed he lacked the natural aptitude and the experience to deal with people and official government duties. It is a fascinating and dumb what-if scenario to imagine a man who spent his life thinking about the universe trying to navigate the messy world of international politics. This shows that even the smartest man on Earth knew when to say no to a promotion. 58. The famous songwriters who wrote the classic anthem, "Take Me Out to the Ballgame," had actually never stepped foot inside a real baseball stadium when they wrote the lyrics. Jack Norworth wrote the catchy words on a scrap of paper while riding a subway train after seeing an advertisement for an upcoming game at the Polo Grounds in New York. He didn't actually attend a professional game until over 20 years after his song had become the most famous sports tune in the entire world. It is a ridiculous and dumb fact that the ultimate baseball fan song was written by two guys who didn't care. 59. King Louis XIV of France was so obsessed with comfort and luxury that he reportedly owned exactly 413 different beds spread across his various royal palaces. He believed that a king should never have to wait for a bed to be made, so he kept multiple rooms ready for him to take a nap at any moment during the day or night. It is a hilariously excessive example of royal wealth because most people back then were lucky to have a single pile of straw to sleep on. This proves that being the Sun King meant never having to worry about finding a place to sleep. 60. While we use it today to mean laughing out loud, the acronym LOL was actually used in the 1960s by medical staff to describe a little old lady. Nurses would write the code in their official logs to quickly identify elderly female patients who were coming into the hospital for regular checkups or minor issues. It is a funny and dumb linguistic coincidence that a term we now use for internet humor started out as a practical way for doctors to organize their patient files. This proves that slang can change its meaning entirely over a few decades and leave everyone feeling very confused. 61. Cotton candy was actually co-invented by a professional dentist named William Morrison back in 1897, who teamed up with a candy maker to create fairy floss. It is hilariously dumb that a guy who makes his living by drilling out painful cavities was the one responsible for creating the stickiest and most sugary snack on the planet. He created a machine that spun sugar into fluffy clouds that we still love to eat at the carnival today. Maybe he was just trying to create his own job security by making sure every kid in town needed a major dental appointment before summer ended. 62. The famous acronym OMG first appeared in a 1917 letter written to Winston Churchill from a retired British admiral named Lord Fisher. It is absolutely ridiculous to imagine a high-ranking military official using internet slang while soldiers were fighting in muddy trenches across Europe during World War I. He was apparently so shocked by the naval news of the day that he used the dramatic abbreviation in a private note to the future Prime Minister. This proves that the way we talk today isn't nearly as modern as we think because people have been lazy with their vocabulary for over a century. 63. The United States Postal Service unintentionally allowed parents to send their actual children through the mail back in 1913 because there were no official rules specifically banning it. Since it was often much cheaper to pay for a few stamps than to buy a real train ticket, families would simply pin postage to their children's coats and hand them to the mailman for delivery. The postal workers would then watch over the kids while they traveled in mail cars to their grandparents' houses, which is the most ridiculous and dangerous parenting hack ever. Thankfully, the government finally stepped in and banned shipping humans. 64. The Guinness Book of World Records was created specifically to settle stupid pub arguments by the managing director of a brewery named Sir Hugh Beaver. He was out on a hunting trip in Ireland when he got into a heated debate about which game bird was the fastest in Europe, but nobody could find the answer. He realized that people in bars all over the world were probably fighting over similar dumb facts while drinking his beer, so he decided to create an official book of records. It is the ultimate example of a successful global business born out of pure stubbornness and alcohol. 65. The planet Uranus was originally named Georgium Sidus after King George III by the astronomer William Herschel, who discovered the gas giant in 1781. He wanted to suck up to the British monarchy to secure more funding for his research, so he named the new planet after the living king. People outside of England thought it was the dumbest idea ever to name a celestial body after a mortal man, instead of an ancient god from mythology. Eventually, the name was changed to Uranus to fit in with the rest of the solar system, which saved us from a very weird space map. 66. Leo Fender created the legendary Stratocaster and changed rock and roll forever. But the truly ridiculous part is that he never learned how to play the guitar. He was a brilliant expert at electronics and engineering, but he was completely tone-deaf when it came to actually making music with his own inventions. He had to hire professional musicians to come into his shop and test out the prototypes because he had no idea if they even sounded good or not. It is a hilariously dumb irony that the most famous guitar maker in history was a total musical amateur for his entire life. 67. Ancient Roman gladiators were the ultimate tough guys of history, but modern science reveals that most of them were actually committed vegetarians who survived on barley. While we imagine them eating huge chunks of meat, they actually consumed massive amounts of carbs to build up a thick layer of body fat. This extra padding acted like a biological shield that protected their vital organs from shallow sword cuts during their bloody battles in the arena. It is a ridiculous and dumb image to think of these fierce warriors as bean-eating machines who were just trying to stay chunky to survive their fights. 68. Ancient Rome actually had fierce female warriors known as gladiatrices who fought just as bravely as the men in the dirt of the arena. These women were a massive hit with the crowds because they were a rare and shocking sight for citizens who expected women to stay at home and spin wool. Some emperors loved the novelty of female combat so much that they would host special midnight matches under torchlight to make the events feel even more dramatic. It is a weirdly progressive but also incredibly brutal part of history, where anyone could be a hero as long as they survived the match. 69. The most successful pirate to ever sail the high seas was a Chinese woman named Qing Shi, who commanded a fleet of over 80,000 outlaws. She started as a humble prostitute, but worked her way up to become the boss of a massive pirate confederation that the government could not stop. She was so powerful that she eventually forced the Chinese emperor to grant her a full pardon, and she retired with all of her stolen riches to open a gambling house. It is the most ridiculous rags to riches story because she basically won the pirate game against an entire nation. 70. Ancient Greek athletes at the Olympic Games were required to perform every single event completely naked to show off their physical perfection to the gods. They would coat their entire bodies in thick olive oil, which made them incredibly slippery and very difficult to catch in a wrestling match while thousands of spectators watched. It must have been an incredibly awkward and ridiculous sight for everyone involved, but the Greeks took it very seriously and even banned women from attending to keep things decent. This proves that international sports used to be a lot more revealing than they are in our modern world today. 71. The year 46 BC was officially the longest year in human history because it lasted for a grand total of 445 days. Julius Caesar realized that the Roman calendar was a total mess and completely out of sync with the seasons, so he just added 2 entire extra months to fix the problem. It is hilariously ridiculous to imagine people back then being totally confused about what month it was, while their leader just kept adding days to the calendar like a madman. This was the ultimate solution to a dumb administrative error that actually worked and eventually gave us the leap years we still use. 72. The Sahara Desert was not always a giant sandbox, because it was once home to prehistoric crocodiles that could actually gallop across the land like horses. These terrifying creatures had long legs designed for running, and they could chase down their prey with incredible speed across the ancient, lush landscape. It sounds like a ridiculous nightmare from a low-budget horror movie, but it is a scientific fact of our planet's wild and weird history. Imagining a crocodile sprinting toward you on a savanna is way scarier than seeing one just floating in a river. and it proves that nature has always been totally insane. 73. Most people today believe that folks in the Middle Ages were convinced the Earth was flat as a pancake, but that is actually a massive historical lie. In reality, almost every educated person back then knew perfectly well that the world was a sphere because they could see the curve of the horizon and the stars. The idea that medieval people were that dumb was actually a myth made up by writers in the 19th century to make themselves look way smarter than their ancestors. It is a funny irony that the people we think were idiots were actually much better at science than we give them credit for. 74. The famous statue of David by Michelangelo was once considered so scandalous and inappropriate that Queen Victoria had a special plaster fig leaf created just to cover its dignity. Whenever the royal family or high society guests visited the museum, the staff had to rush out and attach the giant leaf to the statue to keep the Queen from being offended by the art. It is a ridiculous and dumb example of Victorian censorship because they were literally terrified of a marble statue being naked in public. This proves that even the greatest masterpieces in the world have been bullied by people with zero sense of humor. 75. Augustus Caesar was the first emperor of Rome, and he was also technically the wealthiest person to ever walk the face of the earth with a net worth of over $4 trillion. He personally owned the entire country of Egypt as his private property, and his wealth was so massive that it accounted for about 25% of the entire global economy back then. It is absolutely ridiculous to imagine a single guy having more money than modern tech billionaires and nations combined just by being in charge of an empire. This proves that being an ancient Roman emperor was the ultimate way to secure a massive bag. 76. The Vikings were actually the very first Europeans to discover America, and they reached the shores of Newfoundland about 500 years before Christopher Columbus even set sail. They built a small settlement and lived there for a while, but they eventually left and everyone simply forgot about their epic journey for several centuries. It is a hilariously dumb oversight in our history books that we give all the credit to a guy who was looking for India and got lost. The Vikings were the original explorers of the Western world, but they apparently just did not have a very good public relations team to tell everyone. 77. In ancient Asia, being crushed by a massive elephant was actually a very common and terrifying method of execution for criminals and political enemies of the king. These giant animals were trained to step on people's heads or bodies with extreme precision on command to show off the power and control of the local ruler. It is a horrific and ridiculous way to die. That sounds like something straight out of a weird fantasy novel, but it was a very real part of justice for centuries. This proves that humans have always been incredibly creative when it comes to finding the weirdest and dumbest ways to kill each other. 78. Abraham Lincoln was not just a great leader and the savior of the Union, but he was also a legendary wrestler who is officially in the Wrestling Hall of Fame. During his youth, he was a total beast in the ring, and he reportedly only lost one match out of about 300 bouts against local tough guys. He was famous for his long reach and his incredible strength, which allowed him to toss his opponents around like they were nothing. It is a hilarious and dumb image to think of the honest president in a singlet, ready to suplex anyone who dared to challenge his political views. 79. Valentina Tereshkova became the very first woman to travel into space in 1963, but she accidentally made a very human mistake by forgetting to pack her toothbrush for the mission. She had to spend 3 days orbiting the Earth while living in a tiny capsule, and she had absolutely no way to clean her teeth the entire time she was up there. It is a ridiculous and dumb detail that one of the greatest pioneers of space exploration had to deal with bad breath while making history. This proves that even if you are a literal rocket scientist, you can still forget the most basic things for a trip. 80. The legendary author John Steinbeck had a very mischievous dog that actually ate the original first draft of his classic novel, Of Mice and Men. The dog tore the manuscript into tiny pieces, and the poor writer had to start over from the very beginning because he did not have any backup copies of his work. It is a hilariously dumb and frustrating tragedy for one of the greatest books in American literature because a puppy decided it looked like a tasty snack. This proves that even world-famous writers have to deal with the ridiculous excuse of their dog eating their homework in real life. 81. Back in the early 20th century, French waiters were so passionate about their facial hair that they actually went on a massive strike for the right to grow mustaches. At the time, only the wealthy elite were allowed to have mustaches, and the working class was forced to be clean-shaven, which the waiters felt was totally unfair and insulting. They refused to serve any coffee or food until the laws were changed so they could finally join the elite mustache club. It is a ridiculous and dumb piece of history because people were literally fighting for the right to have hair on their upper lips in public. 82. Genghis Khan was so successful at conquering people and having children that modern geneticists believe about 1 in every 200 people alive today are his direct descendants. This means there are millions of people walking around the world right now who carry the DNA of a man who built the largest land empire in human history. It is a ridiculous and slightly terrifying fact that a single guy from the 13th century had such a massive impact on the global population. This proves that his legacy is much bigger than just a few lines in a history book because it is literally written in our blood. 83. The famous brunch cocktail known as the Bloody Mary was not always named after a legendary queen, because its original and much grosser name was a bucket of blood. The drink was invented in a bar in Paris during the 1920s, and the bartender thought the bright red tomato juice looked just like a fresh bucket of gore from a local slaughterhouse. Thankfully, they eventually changed the name to something a little more appetizing for the morning crowd, but the original version sounds like something a vampire would order. It is a hilarious and dumb branding fail that luckily did not ruin the drink for everyone forever. 84. The ancient Roman Colosseum was not actually the gray crumbling stone building that we see today because it was originally covered in smooth and shining white marble. It was a massive and beautiful structure that glowed in the sun and featured hundreds of bronze statues that looked out over the city of Rome. Over the centuries, people stripped away the marble and the decorations to build other houses and churches, which is why it looks so rough and battered in our modern world. It is a ridiculous and dumb fact that the most famous stadium in history was essentially used as a local hardware store. 85. Marcus Licinius Crassus was one of the wealthiest men in ancient Rome, but his greed eventually led to the most ridiculous and painful death imaginable. After he was captured in a battle, his enemies decided to mock his obsession with money by pouring actual molten gold down his throat. They wanted to give him a taste of the wealth he had spent his entire life chasing in the most literal and brutal way possible. It is a horrific and dumb end for a man who thought that having the most gold made him invincible, but it instead became the very thing that finally ended his life. 86. Even though World War II ended over 80 years ago, the country of Germany still has to uncover and defuse about 2,000 tons of unexploded bombs every single year. These massive explosives are hidden under schools and houses, and construction workers frequently find them while they are just trying to dig a simple hole for a new building. It is a ridiculous and dangerous reality for modern citizens who are still living with the literal remnants of a war that their great-grandparents fought. This proves that history has a very long and explosive tail that can still cause major problems for us today. 87. Ancient Greeks were famous for their philosophy and art, but they actually thought that wearing trousers was the most unmanly and ridiculous thing a person could do. They believed that pants were only for weak barbarians who did not have the strength to show off their legs in traditional robes and tunics. Whenever they saw a foreigner wearing trousers, they would mock them and call them soft for needing extra fabric to keep their legs warm. It is a hilarious and dumb fashion rule from a civilization that literally invented democracy while also hating on the idea of wearing a comfortable pair of pants. 88. There is a fake island called Null Island that exists at exactly 0 degrees north and 0 degrees east, specifically to help computer mapping systems find errors. Even though there is absolutely no land there and it is just open ocean, digital maps often place data points there whenever a GPS coordinate fails to load properly. It is a ridiculous and dumb digital ghost that has become a real place in the world of technology even though you can never actually visit it. This proves that even our high-tech modern world needs a fake place to hide all of its stupid and annoying computer glitches. 89. There is a world-famous hotel in Kenya called Giraffe Manor where you can actually eat your breakfast while giant giraffes stick their heads through the windows to join you. These animals are totally wild, but they know that the guests have tasty treats, so they show up every morning like clockwork to beg for a snack. It is a ridiculous and amazing experience that looks like a total green screen effect, but it is a perfectly real and charming place to stay. This proves that some of the best travel stories in the world involve sharing your morning cereal with a very long neck. 90. The Hoba meteorite is the largest single piece of iron ever found on the surface of our planet, and it weighs an incredible 60 tons. The most ridiculous part is that the meteorite has never actually been moved from the spot where it crashed, because it is simply too heavy for any modern machinery to lift. Instead of taking it to a museum, the government just built a small park around the giant rock right in the middle of a field. It is a dumb and funny reminder that even with all of our technology, we are still sometimes defeated by a very big rock. 91. In the Middle Ages and even up until the 19th century, dentures were often crafted using actual teeth pulled out of the mouths of dead soldiers who had fallen on the battlefield. This sounds like a horrific nightmare, but it was a very common practice because human teeth were the most natural-looking material available for wealthy people who had lost their own smiles. It is absolutely ridiculous and gross to imagine a fancy aristocrat sitting at a dinner party and chewing on their steak using the literal teeth of a stranger who died in a war. This proves that dental hygiene used to be a lot more metal and terrifying. 92. The powerful Russian leader Peter the Great was a man of extreme and sometimes very dark habits because he once kept his own wife's lover's severed head in a jar. After discovering the secret affair, he had the man executed and then forced his wife to keep the preserved head in her bedroom as a constant and grisly reminder of her mistake. It is a ridiculously twisted and dumb way to handle a marriage problem that proves even the most famous world leaders could be incredibly petty and terrifyingly cruel. History shows that being royalty often meant you could get away with the most insane and weird behaviors imaginable. 93. A single tall poplar tree in the middle of a buffer zone once nearly triggered the start of World War III between North and South Korea back in 1976. United States and South Korean soldiers were sent to trim the branches because they were blocking a view, but the North Korean soldiers attacked them, which led to a massive military standoff. The Americans eventually returned with a huge force of helicopters and B-52 bombers just to finish cutting down the one tree. It is a hilariously dumb and dangerous example of how a tiny bit of yard work can almost end the entire world. 94. During the Second World War, a Japanese diplomat named Chiune Sugihara became a real-life hero by going against his own government's orders to save thousands of innocent lives. He spent nearly 20 hours a day handwriting travel visas for Jewish refugees who were desperately trying to flee the country and survive the conflict. He was essentially the Japanese version of Oskar Schindler, and he continued writing the papers until his train pulled away from the station. It is an amazing and beautiful piece of history that shows how a single person can stand up for what is right, even when everyone else is being silent. 95. The Sultana was a massive steamboat disaster that happened at the end of the American Civil War, and it actually killed more people than the sinking of the Titanic. Even though over 1,000 people lost their lives when the boilers exploded on the Mississippi River, the event is almost completely forgotten today because it happened right after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. It is a ridiculous and tragic historical oversight, where the biggest maritime disaster in United States history was buried by a larger news cycle. This proves that being the biggest headline of the day really matters if you want to be remembered. 96. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were the founding fathers of the United States, but they were also low-key criminals who once stole a piece of Shakespeare's chair. While they were visiting the famous writer's home in England, they decided that they wanted a souvenir, and they actually chipped off a piece of the wood while no one was looking. It is hilariously dumb to imagine two future presidents acting like rowdy tourists and vandalizing a historical landmark just for a cool story to tell back home. This proves that even the most respected men in history can be a little bit immature sometimes. 97. Easter Island is a tiny and remote place in the middle of the Pacific Ocean that is famous for being home to exactly 887 giant stone statues. We always think of them as just being massive heads, but archaeologists eventually discovered that the statues have full bodies buried deep beneath the ground. The local people worked for centuries to carve and move these huge monuments using only primitive tools and sheer manpower. It is a ridiculous and amazing feat of engineering that proves that humans have always been willing to work incredibly hard on a project just to leave a lasting mark. 98. The world-famous Leaning Tower of Pisa was actually never straight from the very beginning of its construction because the ground beneath it was much too soft. As soon as the workers reached the third floor, the building started to tilt, but instead of fixing it, they just kept building higher and higher for 200 years. It is a hilariously dumb engineering failure that accidentally became one of the most recognizable landmarks on the entire planet. This proves that if you make a big enough mistake and wait long enough, people might eventually start coming from all over the world just to take pictures. 99. Queen Elizabeth II was a legendary figure who ruled for decades, but she was actually never expected to take the throne when she was born. She was only a distant heir until her uncle unexpectedly abdicated the throne for love, which suddenly made her the next in line to become the Queen of England. It is a ridiculous and lucky turn of events that changed the entire course of British history and turned a young girl into one of the most famous monarchs ever. This proves that your life can change in a single day, even if you are already a member of the royal family. 100. The shortest sword that was ever used in a real-life battle was a weapon from the Bronze Age that measured only 10 inches in length. It was basically a glorified kitchen knife, but it was used by soldiers who had to fight in incredibly close quarters, where long blades were too heavy to swing. It is a hilariously dumb image to think of a warrior charging into a massive war carrying a weapon that looks like it belongs in a lunchbox. This proves that size does not always matter in a fight as long as you are brave enough to actually use what you have. 101. There is a small town in central Italy that has a fountain that actually flows with free red wine 24 hours a day for everyone to enjoy. It was built by a local winery to refresh weary travelers who were walking along a famous pilgrimage route, and they wanted to show off their local hospitality. It is a ridiculous and amazing dream come true for anyone who loves a good drink because you can just walk up and fill your glass for free. This proves that some parts of the world are much more fun and generous than the places where we live in the States. 102. A tiny town in Alaska once had a fluffy orange cat named Stubbs as its official honorary mayor for over 20 years. The cat was so popular with the locals that they kept re-electing him year after year because he didn't raise taxes or get into any political scandals like the humans. He spent most of his days sitting in the local general store and drinking water out of a wine glass while the tourists came to visit him. It is a hilariously dumb and sweet example of local politics, where an animal with a tail did a better job than any politician ever. 103. During World War II, the British military used a very strange secret weapon by using a homeless man's body to trick the Nazi high command. They dressed the man in an officer's uniform and gave him fake secret plans before dropping him in the ocean where the enemy would find him. The Germans fell for the trap completely and moved their troops to the wrong location, which allowed the Allies to win a major victory in the war. It is a ridiculous and brilliant spy story that proves that even the smallest details can change the fate of an entire global conflict. 104. The United States military created a legendary unit called the Ghost Army during World War II that used inflatable rubber tanks and giant speakers to trick the Germans. These soldiers were actually artists and sound engineers who would set up fake camps to make the enemy believe that a massive army was about to attack them from a different direction. It is absolutely hilarious to think that the outcome of a serious war was influenced by a group of guys playing with giant balloons and sound effects. This proves that sometimes being the most creative is much more important than having the most real firepower. 105. During the era of Prohibition, the United States government actually decided to poison the industrial alcohol supply to stop people from drinking illegally. They knew that people were stealing the alcohol to make their own drinks, so they added deadly chemicals that unfortunately led to the deaths of thousands of citizens. It is a terrifying and dumb decision by the authorities that shows just how desperate they were to enforce a law that almost everyone was ignoring anyway. This proves that the government can sometimes be much more dangerous than the criminals they are trying to catch in the first place. 106. The very first computer bug in history was actually a literal moth that got trapped inside a massive machine and caused it to stop working in 1947. A female computer scientist named Grace Hopper found the insect and taped it into her official logbook with a note about the first actual case of a bug being found. It is a hilariously dumb and literal origin story for a term that every single person who uses a phone or a laptop uses today. This proves that even our most advanced technology can be taken down by a single confused bug that was looking for a light. 107. In 1952, the city of London was hit by a massive and thick layer of smog that was so heavy it actually stopped trains and killed 4,000 people. The air was so filled with pollution from coal fires that people could not see their own feet while they were walking down the street during the middle of the day. It is a ridiculous and tragic environmental disaster that forced the government to finally pass new laws to clean up the air for everyone. This proves that sometimes things have to get extremely bad and dangerous before people finally decide to make a change. 108. In the year 1518, a bizarre dancing plague broke out in a town in France where hundreds of people started dancing uncontrollably for several weeks without stopping. They could not stop their bodies from moving, and many of them eventually died from strokes or pure physical exhaustion because they literally danced themselves to death. It is a ridiculous and mysterious medical event that sounds like a total lie, but it was a very real and terrifying disaster for the local community. This proves that the human brain can sometimes do very strange and dumb things that even modern doctors cannot explain. 109. In a small town in Honduras, there is a bizarre weather event where it actually rains fish from the sky nearly every single year during the rainy season. After a massive storm, hundreds of small silver fish are found flopping around in the streets, and the locals gather them up to cook a big feast for their families. Scientists believe the fish are picked up by waterspouts and dropped on the town, but it remains a ridiculous and amazing mystery. This proves that the natural world is much weirder and more generous than we could ever imagine in our wild dreams. 110. There is a terrifying-looking waterfall in Antarctica that flows with a deep blood-red liquid, which makes it look like the glacier is actually bleeding. For a long time, people thought it was caused by microscopic algae, but scientists eventually discovered that the red color comes from ancient salt water trapped deep under the ice. The iron in the water reacts with the air and turns red just like rust, which creates a ridiculous and beautiful alien landscape on our own planet. This proves that nature has a very dramatic way of showing off its chemistry secrets to us today. 111. The tree of Tener was once the most isolated tree on the entire planet because it was the only one for over 250 miles in the desert. It was a legendary landmark that travelers used to find their way across the sand until a drunk driver managed to hit the only tree in the middle of nowhere. It is a hilariously dumb and tragic way for a famous natural wonder to die, because the odds of hitting that one tree were nearly zero. This proves that humans have a very unique talent for ruining things even in the most empty places on Earth. If your brain is currently leaking out of your ears after that historical dumpster fire, then my work here is officially done. Most of history is basically just people making it up as they go along, so if you're ready to admit that your expensive education was essentially a series of lies, go ahead and smash that like button and subscribe to Dumb History before we both lose our minds. Now, I have a question for the real ones. Which of these 111 facts made you want to call your history teacher and demand a refund for your time? Drop your pick in the comments below, share this with a friend who still thinks they're smart, and click these videos on the screen right now to keep ruining your childhood one weird story at a time.